the fear, the concern would always be that this whole crisis would push them further towards accelerating the drive towards getting a nuclear bomb, because they'll see that's the only thing capable of ensuring deterrence and perhaps the regime's survival.
One of the things we've learned over the years is that any kind of military intervention, it has unintended consequences, and we just don't know what those are going to be.
There are all sorts of doomsday scenarios as well being speculated about, around the possibility of dirty bombs, asymmetric warfare, Iran, activating terrorism cells. What's the calculation there? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Somewhere between total obliteration and significant damage. That's what the American administration is saying it has done to Iran after its weekend airstrikes on its nuclear facilities. But it may be a bigger phrase than that in terms of the significance for the region and the wider world. For this special forecast this morning, I'm in Washington, D.C. Our International Editor Lindsey Hilsum joins us from London, and our correspondent Secunder Kermani joins us from Jerusalem. Lindsey, the Iranian foreign minister is going to Russia today, and there have been airstrikes by Israel on Iran. I mean, where does it look like this is going today?
Well, at the moment, what the Iranian foreign minister is doing is he's trying to get as much diplomatic support as possible. And the Russians have been a little bit equivocal, really, in their support for Iran. But today, Putin seemed to be more condemnatory of the Americans than he had been before. But diplomatic support, what is that going to do for Iran at this point? The Israelis are just banging away. They have hit Evin prison, which is where many political prisoners are being held, some of whom were apparently injured. They've hit the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard. There are many targets which they're going for, which are very much not the nuclear facilities or even military facilities. They are regime targets. And so it looks as if the Israelis are trying to weaken the Islamic Republic as much as possible, while the Americans are sort of pulling back a little bit. So President Trump, but what President Trump says, it sort of varies, because J.D. Vance, his vice president, was very clear, saying yesterday, we are not going for regime change. This is about the nuclear program. And then President Trump tweets today, well, maybe it is going to be regime change. So as ever, when you put President Trump into the mix, what seems clear suddenly becomes not so clear after all.
What about the actual damage done to the nuclear sites? Because it's now seeming clear that Iran had time to move some of its facilities. It might well have got the uranium and the centrifuges out. All we've seen are pictures of essentially holes in the sand. So how confident can we be about what's actually been done?
I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, President Trump yesterday was very keen to say, the Iranian nuclear program has been obliterated. But even then, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was saying, well, we'll have to wait for the battlefield assessment. And one of the problems is if you hit a facility which is deeply underground, well, the satellite pictures aren't going to show you very much, are you? You need to be able to have a camera that goes deep into the earth, and they don't have that. Now, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has said that there's no question that there is serious damage to Fordo, that is the deep underground facility. But they don't have the ability at the moment to really make that assessment. And yes, there are reports that there are 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. That's uranium which has been enriched to 60%. You need 90% for a bomb, but it's a short step from 60 to 90 apparently. And yes, we don't know where that is. Was it in the underground facility, or did they move it some weeks or months earlier? As yet, we just don't know.
Secunder, I mean, what's the reaction been like in Israel? Are they all cock-a-hoop?
Well, look, certainly the Israeli government had been wanting President Trump to carry out these strikes. They know, as all analysts have been saying for the last couple of weeks, that it's only these huge 30,000-pound American bunker buster bombs that were able to take out or cause significant damage, at least to the Fordo underground nuclear facility. So we had Israeli officials calling on the Trump administration to get involved. And so, yes, they are, I think, absolutely happy. We've in fact seen Prime Minister Netanyahu's popularity rise as a result of this. The war with Iran has a lot of popular support here in Israel. Many here are now, at this stage, divided about the war in Gaza, and a majority, around 70% of the population, would be willing to see an end to the conflict there in exchange for the return of the hostages. But support for the war with Iran is much, much higher, but 70 to 80% of people. And anytime, certainly, I've spoken to people, even those living at sites that have been struck by Iranian ballistic missiles that have managed to penetrate the Israeli air defense systems, they say that we consider the possibility of a nuclear armed Iran as an existential threat. And so this is something that we believe needed to happen. At the moment, I think that's the kind of main feeling here, both politically and at a grassroots level. I mean, interestingly, even Netanyahu's political opponents, some of those on further to the left of him, have been praising his actions and his decision, going on board with his decision to attack the Iranians. We'll have to wait and see, I think, as you and Lindsey are pointing out, about exactly how much damage has been caused to Iran's nuclear capabilities, because the fear, the concern would always be that actually if the regime retains any ability to carry out further enrichment, that this whole crisis would push them further towards accelerating the drive towards getting a nuclear bomb, because they'll see that's the only thing capable of ensuring deterrence and perhaps the regime's survival.
And if there is perhaps deliberate ambiguity here in Washington about the aims of the American strikes, are the war aims becoming any clearer in Israel?
Well, I've asked the Israeli foreign minister whether regime change was one of their aims. He and Prime Minister Netanyahu have both said that it is not, that their aim is to destroy the nuclear capabilities, the ballistic missile capabilities held by Iran. But it does seem a little bit more vague than that, just as you've had that confusion around Trump's own stance. So there's been images that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's put out on Twitter that show the Iranian monarch's flag, the royal flag of Iran. And so I think certainly the Israelis would like to see a regime change in Iran, but we've seen actions that are probably undertaken by them. For example, hacking of the Iranian state TV broadcaster with calls for people to come out to the streets. We've had repeated calls by Netanyahu to the Iranian people to overthrow their regime. So they certainly would like to see it happen. Whether they're capable of doing it, I think, is another question. I mean, I can't think of another example in history, perhaps you and Lindsey can, of when regime change has been implemented by an outside power that does not have ground troops invading a country, as it seems out of the question, and without any kind of local allied for opposition force ready to swoop in and take on the existing government.
Lindsey, what's going on in Iran?
Well, look, we're seeing through a glass darkly, but the voice messages that we're able to get from there suggest that there is a lot of consternation on the part of people who are in the central part of Tehran. Evin prison is right in the center of Tehran. So, people heard that go up and were scared. And then we've had messages. There was somebody, a political prisoner, who was in there who called his family. And there was a recording of that, who just described, the terror of it. You think about it. You're a political prisoner. You've been put away for being against the government, against the Islamic Republic. And then suddenly the Israelis, who are probably trying to destabilize, if not overthrow the regime, are bombing you. I mean, in that sense, people are totally confused. And as Secunder says, there's no organized opposition. So Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the last Shah, he's trying to sort of set himself up as some kind of opposition leader, but he's in Washington. He's a Pahlavi on the Potomac. Maybe you'll go and see him. I mean, there he is. And this whole operation by the Israelis, they've called it Rising Lion. Well, the lion is his symbol. But he doesn't really have any following in Iran, almost none. and people are, they're worried about water, they're worried about electricity. There's electricity blackouts in some of the city. The internet is down most of the time. We're only able to get messages sporadically because most of the time people can't communicate. And so people are scared.
And are there still foreign prisoners in Evin prison? I mean, this is obviously where Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was held, isn't it?
Yeah, there are I know of two French prisoners who are in there. And interestingly, I was in Geneva on Friday, and the French foreign minister was talking about them and saying that one of the things they really want is their people back. Now, they're both in Evin, and I'm sure there are others as well, because often countries don't publicize what's happened to their people in Iran, because it's deemed that quiet diplomacy will do better. So yes, there are definitely foreign prisoners in there.
Now, in terms of what Iran might do next, I mean, it hasn't really done very much so far, other than its diplomatic, moves, and saying it will respond in the manner to which it chooses. Now, the Parliament has talked about closing the Strait of Hormuz. What's the significance of that? Can it do it, and how would it do it?
Yeah, so Iran has a number of options. So the option which would cause a lot of economic damage is closing the Straits of Hormuz. Now, this is a narrow waterway through which a large proportion of the world's oil comes. But that, if they close that, which they could do by using sea mines or, small boats or whatever, that also affects the oil which is going to their allies, including China. So, as well as obviously to Western countries. So that's quite a difficult thing to do. But they can do that, and the parliament has said that they will do that. The Iranian parliament doesn't dictate what happens, but it gives its advice. Now, then you've got US forces, about 40,000 of them across the region in places like Bahrain and Qatar and the UAE and Iraq. They could attack those facilities but of course those facilities are well prepared for attack. They knew that might happen. And interestingly, after the Americans killed Soleimani, the leader of the IRGC, a few years back, the Iranians, they wanted to retaliate, but they didn't want to start World War III. So they warned the Americans that they were going to attack facilities, particularly in Iraq. So the Americans knew to get their people out. So in a sense, it was almost symbolic. They could do something like that, or they could go for it. And they could, they have cells in different places. They may be weaker in the region than they were because their proxies like Hezbollah and so on are much weakened by Israel over the last year. But, they may well have terrorist cells in different countries which could attack Israeli or American targets. I mean, there have been Iranian journalists here working for opposition channels who have been attacked, and Scotland Yard has said that the Iranian government is behind that. So, you could see all sorts of little attacks like that, little in the sense of not being complete outright war, but attacks nonetheless.
Secunder, how much damage is actually being done in Israel now? I mean, we keep hearing about how depleted the Iranian ballistic missile battery is, but they're still sending things over and they're getting through.
They are at times. So Iran was said to have had around 2,500 ballistic missiles prior to the start of this conflict. The latest figures we have from the Israeli army are that around 500 of them had been fired. So that would suggest that there's a substantial number still there, even if you account for a number which the Israeli army are likely to have managed to destroy with their strikes. The military here also says, however, they've destroyed around half of all Iran's ballistic missile launches, and we have certainly seen a very significant drop-off in the scale of the attacks that Iran has been launching. So, in the initial few days of the war, we were seeing dozens and dozens of missiles being launched, up to 100 at times. Now, around 3:00 in the morning this morning, we had a single ballistic missile that was intercepted. I think around 10 were fired later in the day. Yesterday was one of them in the morning. So kind of the first initial perhaps reaction to those American significant strikes in Iran. We saw a barrage of around 20 to 30 ballistic missiles. So there's definitely been a drop off. The Iranians, I think, might suggest that they're perhaps conserving some of their stock for a longer war. But given the scale of Israel's attacks on Iran, I think it's quite possible that they have now a very significantly reduced capability to strike Israel. Of course, you've been here, both of you, so the Israeli air defense system is very sophisticated, very powerful. It is not 100%, and so we see on occasion some missiles managing to get through. The death toll here, around 24 people, I believe, is still the current figure. I mean, that's significant by Israeli standards, and of course, every death anywhere in the world of a civilian is a tragedy. But it's much lower than the number of people who are killed in Iran. I think the latest figures I saw from human rights groups working there was suggesting around in excess of 600 people, at least around, or approximately around half of them civilians being killed. So the damage that's been done to Israel has not at this stage reached a proportion that's making ordinary people or politicians rethink their decisions. There was reporting towards the beginning of the war saying that Israeli intelligence officials had, when devising plans for an attack on Iran, which of course had been, being prepared for many years, they looked at potentially casualties being and fatalities being in the thousands, and we're certainly not at a stage like that. And whilst everyone here, I think, is expecting that there will be some Iranian military retaliation that could take the form of, a ramping up of the missile barrages, at the moment, people here, I think, are feeling fairly confident.
I mean, I was very struck by your report last night, actually, where you had a man who'd lost his home, but he seemed incredibly sanguine and quite confident that it was the final stage of the war.
Yeah, I think most Israelis. I mean, I was speaking to some in a shelter earlier this morning near where we were when sirens went off, and was chatting to them about how they were feeling. And of course, many people do feel afraid, but a lot of them also said that they hope that there's now a kind of off-ramp possibility, and that once Iran has conducted some kind of strike, which they hope will be largely safe, face-saving rather than escalatory, then there could be the possibility of negotiations. I mean, the Trump administration has certainly held out that possibility. And, you guys have been talking about the stockpile of around 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that is probably still exists somewhere in Iran. So I would have thought it would very much be in the US and Israel's interest to try and strike some kind of deal with the Iranians to ensure that is not enriched to the 90% weapons grade quality that it could be, were there to be a complete breakdown in any kind of communications with the Iranians, and they take their nuclear program completely underground.
Lindsey, I mean, there are all sorts of doomsday scenarios as well being speculated about around the possibility of dirty bombs, asymmetric warfare, Iran, activating terrorism cells. There was a report here in America from NBC who was saying that the Iranians had already warned Trump indirectly that they had sleeper cells in the United States. What's the calculation there?
Well, there's a number of calculations out there. So you've got the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who's 86. So what does he want? Well, he wants the regime to survive, and to survive after his death, which will presumably come at some point in the next few years. And he built up this system of having the proxies across the region and so on, and having this strength through the nuclear program, much of which has been destroyed. And so, arguably his life's work has come to very little in the end. So there is one argument which says that, he will just go down fighting, that he wants to be seen as a fighter and a martyr. He doesn't care what comes after him, but he's got a son who might inherit the role. There's all sorts of calculations which we don't really know about. There's maneuvering within the regime, we understand, from rumors in the way that these things are, that different people saying that they now want to take over because they are weakened. And then, of course, there is the possibility that the regime might actually collapse. Now, if it collapsed, what would replace it? Well, probably chaos, because I think Secunder was saying this earlier. You cannot see a way in which the Islamic Republic collapses, and what you get in its place is some kind of marvelous democratic system. You might get a coup, or you might get complete disorder. So a lot of it depends on what the people in charge are afraid of, and what what kind of fractures there are within the Islamic Republic between the army and the Revolutionary Guards. And a lot of this we just don't know.
And at the beginning, we mentioned this meeting with Russia. I mean, Russia could, in theory, completely change the game, couldn't they? Because they could supply Iran with more weapons. It doesn't look like that's going to happen.
President Putin has quite a good relationship with Netanyahu and with the Israelis. And he also has another war to fight, remember. He's been getting the drones from Iran, although the Iranian drones, which are used the Russians to fight in Ukraine, they now produce them inside Russia. So yes, he could do that, but nothing indicates that he wants to do that. Nothing indicates that he feels that the Iranian cause is worth a lot of expenditure of diplomatic and financial capital at all. I think what he would like would be some kind of negotiation. That was what he's been indicating today in his meeting with the Iranian foreign minister.
And is it conceivable that Iran could enter negotiations without hitting back, or first, or do they have to do that to save face effectively?
I think that they would be more likely to hit back in some way first, because not just about saving face, it's also about negotiating from what appears to be a position of strength. And yet it is quite clear, and everybody knows, that the Iranians will not be negotiating from a position of strength. They'll be negotiating from a position of weakness, because this war has weakened them thoroughly. So I think that they will be reaching out, the meeting with the Russians today. They're trying to build up this kind of greater diplomatic strength, which would compensate for their military weakness. But the problem is, what would they be negotiating for? Because President Trump has said zero enrichment, and the Israelis are saying an end to their ballistic missile program. Now that leaves them extremely weakened in the region and as a government, as a regime, because what sovereignty would the country have if it cannot have any effective military force, not just a nuclear program, but a military force? That's the basis on which most countries operate, that they can defend themselves. Iran at the moment, it seems, can't defend itself. So they're in an extremely difficult situation when it comes to diplomacy as well.
Just finally, Secunder, from Israel. I mean, when I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago, there were more voices of criticism of Netanyahu, and politically the voices of against Netanyahu have been very, very consistent. People are still very angry with him, regardless of what's been going on in Gaza. Has he helped himself and shored up his position politically by extending the war in Iran?
Yes, I think he has. I mean, I was looking at some reports suggesting that Netanyahu is currently more popular than he's been at any stage since October the 7th, when, his popularity took a massive, massive dip. It's interesting. Some of those figures politically, for example, who have been very critical of Netanyahu and have been associated with the protest movement against him, Yair Golan, for example, who's a leading left-wing politician. I saw him at the site of an Iranian missile attack, and I asked him what his thoughts were, and he said no, I'm supportive of the war with Iran, because I believe that there was no choice about this. That he remains a critic of Netanyahu, but certainly I think that's representative of the vast majority of people who are opposed to Netanyahu, that they might not like him, they might not necessarily trust him, but they support this war, and they believe that the intelligence that led to it was correct, because it was furnished by not just Netanyahu, but by the Israeli army and security services, who they do have more faith in. Interestingly, I was just speaking earlier today, actually, with a father of one of the Israeli hostages who's still in Gaza, someone who's been also very critical of Netanyahu. He too, didn't think that he thought that the war in Iran was justified, but he was upset and angry that the cases of the hostages, their plight has been very much overshadowed and clearly doesn't seem much of a priority for the government and for Netanyahu at this stage, and it's kind of fallen a bit away from public discourse as well. And of course, for the civilians living in Gaza, for ordinary people there, the situation remains absolutely awful. I mean, the death toll, the daily death toll, frankly, in Gaza completely outshadows anything that we're seeing anywhere else in this troubled region. It's not getting the kind of focus and headlines that it once was, but the situation on the ground there is much worse than anywhere else.
And Lindsey, I mean, internationally, obviously, again, Netanyahu was facing a lot of criticism from Britain and France and Canada over Gaza. The British statement on the Iranian bombing over the weekend was, well, I mean, it was just a sort of a statement of fact. It wasn't really expressing any opinion one way or another. Has Trump managed to to silence Britain and pull them back in behind?
Look, I think that there's been a massive outbreak of hypocrisy because the Europeans and also the Gulf Arab countries and so on have all said that they were against this. And I think that a lot of people within those governments are breathing a sigh of relief and thinking, oh, jolly good. They've set back the Iranian nuclear program or destroyed the nuclear program. But then there'll be other voices within those governments who say, but what is the cost of this? And the cost is international law. If you remember, we went back to Iraq in 2003. Do you remember there were weeks of going through the UN and talking about the legality and UN Security Council resolutions and also trying to get some kind of international consensus? All of that has gone by the board. We're now in a world where Vladimir Putin can invade Ukraine and he just does it, where the Israelis can attack Iran and then the Americans can attack Iran as well. And, international law, the system where you had some kind of rules, where things went through the Security Council, all of that is gone. Now, when you have the Europeans who are choosing, not to say very much or just to say a little because actually they're kind of a little bit in favor, also just a little bit worried about it, what does that mean? It's about the future as well. So what about when China invades Taiwan? What happens then? Why shouldn't they? Given that the Russians have done what they wanted to do, the Israelis and the Americans have done what they wanted to do. And these statements, these sort of, milquetoast statements from the Europeans, it just makes them look pusillanimous and weak.
Yes, I mean, Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, has apparently just said that the US strikes on Iran were not in violation of international law. I've no idea on what basis he's saying that. There was no UN resolution. There was no imminent threat. How could it possibly be in line with international law?
I don't know, but you can find a lawyer to tell you anything, can't you? Which was the kind of argument which we had before the Iraq war. And
just finally on Trump, then, I mean, obviously he's impossible to predict, but do you think he's likely to do anything more militarily?
Look, I can predict anything apart from the future. And I certainly can't predict what Donald Trump is going to do. I mean, he said himself last week, doesn't he? Nobody knows what I'm going to do. I'd like to make up my mind a second before I do it. So if he can't even predict what he's going to do himself, how could I? But obviously the Americans have a choice at this point, which is to pull right back, leave it to the Israelis to do whatever, weaken the Islamic Republic, possibly, cause its collapse, and push for negotiations, which is what he has indicated that he wants to do. But if the Iranians do hit back, and if, for example, they kill Americans somewhere, then there are going to be voices around Donald Trump to say, well, we need to bomb something else. We need to go in again. We need to do more. And that's what his sort of isolationist MAGA wing, the people like Steve Bannon and so on, are worried about. They're worried about the Americans getting pulled into a wider war. He has said he doesn't want to do that. But one of the things we've learned over the years is that any kind of military intervention, it has unintended consequences. And we just don't know what those are going to be.
Indeed. And it's worth mentioning that it appears that Trump had lunch with Steve Bannon on the day that he ordered the strikes. And the American reaction here has been quite remarkable, really. And it's quite illustrative, I think, of how weak Congress is at the moment, and that there are a lot of Democrats who are saying this was unconstitutional. The American president doesn't have the power to carry out this kind of military action without congressional approval. And some Republicans are saying the same thing, a very small number. But the president and the administration have absolutely no doubt that they were within their rights to do this. They're showing no sign of taking this to Congress in the near future, and so they will just carry on. We'll leave it there. Secunder, Lindsey, thank you very much indeed. That's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.